Hello.
Thank you for coming, and thank
Yeah.
all of you for coming. Thank yourselves. Hi, Terry. So, like Caitlin said, some of our folks are big fans here, including myself, and some folks are not as deeply familiar with you.
Some folks are not.
Yeah. So I thought I'd start out with asking you a little bit about how you came to Portland, like a little bit like first where you came from, because it's such a wonderful story, and and how you got here to this city, working on the projects that you do now.
Sure. I was raised mostly in Boise, Idaho, Mormon. Between there and several different cities or towns in Mexico. My mom is from Mexico. My dad is from Idaho. And I went to high school there, graduated, moved to New York City because I was forced to be a Mormon missionary. So I was there during 9/11 in the Bronx, Spanish-speaking mission. I grew up speaking Spanish, so I didn't have to learn it, thank goodness. And after that, moved to Los Angeles. I thought I was going to go to school there. But after living there for a few years, I was like, this is not for me. And then I had a friend who was living here already that I went to high school with. She was working in comics. And she was like, why don't you just move to Portland? I live here. It's closer to home, Idaho. There's no sales tax, and it's very conducive to sitting inside and drawing and writing all day because it rains like 6 months out of the year here. So just come here and go to art school. She flew down. I drove up with her. And the week that I moved here in 2006, it felt like it was meant to be because I got into art school, I found an apartment, and I found a job, like all in 1 week. So then I went to art school. I went to the PNCA, Pacific Northwest College of Art. I got a degree in illustration, which is, I guess, somewhat, I still draw plenty, but the bulk of my work now is writing. So I guess that's kind of funny, but that's sort of how I started my life here in Portland. I got to know, because like I said, it's conducive to drawing and writing all day. There are so many comic book artists and writers in Portland. 3 of the largest independent comic book companies are located here. So there's just a lot of artists who are involved in that. So I felt like it was good for meeting people, networking, and pretty quickly after college, I joined Helioscope Studio, which is, it's not a business. A lot of people think it's a business, but it's the largest collection of independent comic book artists and writers, I think, in the country. And then we just all share office space there to work. And that's sort of how my comics journey, I guess, started.
That's so great, and that you got a job and found a place to live, like all in one go. Wonderful.
Yeah.
So I love to stay on theme. It's not true, but I did have this question based on our theme, which is pride. So you do a lot of your work is tied to like really specific identities. And so my question was, do you remember your very first Pride event? What was it like, if you care to share? And at the time, were you ready to express the fullness of whatever Pride meant at the time?
I do remember my first Pride event. I was living in Los Angeles, so it was like the Los Angeles West Hollywood Pride event. Yeah. I took a lot of photos. I have photos of like Anna Nicole Smith, and Paris Hilton, So it was just a very bizarre, very weird experience. But I went with a lot of friends. I was excited I thought when I moved to California, I was very excited to be somewhere, I was fresh off of my Mormon mission. I flew back to Idaho, I bought a car, I drove to Los Angeles, and I never went to church again. I was like, I'm done. I gave you 2 years of my life, I'm done. So I thought I would be very happy to be somewhere where it was like, it's okay to be who I am. It's okay to be accepted here. I'm in Los Angeles. There's a lot of Mexicans here. There's a lot of queer people here. I won't get into this story, but I felt somewhat uncomfortable living in Los Angeles because I wasn't like 6'1", 160, abs, blonde hair, blue eye, you know what I mean? Within the gay community in Hollywood. But I did make some good friends. I went to this Pride event it was a lot of fun. It was very crowded, a lot of people, but it did feel good to be somewhere where it was like a celebration, where it didn't matter sort of who you were in that moment, that you could just go there and express what you wanted. You know, like I said, take a bunch of pictures, be with friends. So it was a fun event, but also very interesting and very bizarre.
Much more fun than mine, which was at Mount Rushmore.
Oh, all right. I want to hear that story, but
Well, just briefly, the reason why it's at Mount Rushmore is because that's federal property, and people can't mess with you if you're on federal property. And, very small. That's fun with Hollywood. So I know that your mission in New York, while you were a Mormon, is sort of fundamental to you sort of accepting some multiple identities. Would you mind sharing that story with us?
Sure. I think, well, when you grow up in a military family, Mormon, biracial, bicultural Mexican, in Boise, Idaho in the 90s, you tend to say, I think at least what I did was I segmented myself out quite a bit. So I'd always say it was the easiest thing to just say like, oh, I'm half and half, because people would not understand you're Mexican, but you look white. Oh, my dad's white. You know, so it's this whole story. Also, if you've ever seen a telenovela, you know there are white Mexicans. Like, so I'd always felt like I was, like I said, segmenting myself out. But when I was a missionary, it was a very strange experience, something that I didn't want to do. My parents, Mulan style, were like, "You will bring dishonor to this family," and my older brother didn't go on one, so I was obligated to. But I was living in the Bronx. I thought I knew Spanish because I grew up speaking Mexican Spanish, but Puerto Rican, Dominican, and Cuban dialects are somewhat different than that. So it was interesting learning those, but also living in the Bronx, I would encounter I encountered this group of kids. Junior was, I guess, the leader of their friend group, this young Dominican kid, and he heard me speaking Spanish, but I'm also wearing like a white shirt and tie, and many people thought we were immigration, like, la migra. So I have to be like, no, it's cool, we're just talking about Mormon Jesus. And so he asked me he was like, how are you speaking Spanish? And I told him like, oh, I'm Mexican. He was like, well, you don't look like any Mexican I've ever seen. I was like, again, do you watch telenovelas? But he asked me a very strange question where he said, well, what's your street name? And I was like, what are you talking about? And he said, well, you don't look, Latino. You don't look like us. So because you are white, you need to have a street name around the Bronx so people don't mess with you. He didn't say mess. I was like, you're 11. And I said, I'm sorry, I don't have one. And he was like, it's okay, it's cool. He said, I got you. I'll think of one for you. I was like, all right. And there was a place across from where we lived. It was not Kentucky. It was Kennedy's Fried Chicken. And it was one of those places that had like pizza and burgers and Chinese food and fried, like everything. And a few days later, he came up to me and he was very excited. But he was like, I have your street name. And I was like, well, okay, well, what is it? And he said, you're Ghetto Swirl. And I was like, okay, what does that mean? And he said, you're like the ice cream in Kennedy's. He's like, you're not the brown one, and you're not the white one. You're the one in the middle. And his girlfriend, Shelly, she was like, that's my favorite one. That you get the best of both worlds. That's two for the price of one. And it hit me in this, it's so funny that I felt like I was obligated to have this spiritual experience. But these two kids, I felt, helped me sort out a big part of my identity, which instead of always saying like I'm half and half and segmenting myself out that way, I'd never heard anybody say I'm both. Mm-hmm. And that sounded way more powerful to me. Like Shelly was like, the best flavor, two for the price of one. And that really hit me in an interesting, and I feel like I'm not a spiritual or religious person by any means, but that I felt like hit me in a very meaningful way. And so ever since then, I've always just said like I'm both. And I feel like being able to claim those parts of my identity without saying I'm only so much of this, I'm only so much of that, it's much more powerful, and I think especially in terms of representation and pride, like we're talking about. To like, if you're proud, like then what is it that you're proud of? For me, it's my identity. I was always taught by my parents to be proud of being Mexican, to be proud of where I came from, to be proud of being from a military family. I was born on a military base.
Same.
Fort Ord, California doesn't exist anymore.
Same.
What?
No, oh my God. I had no idea. I was also born in Fort Ord.
I've only ever met like 2 people in my whole life who are. So I have a really bizarre story if you want to hear that about Fort Ord.
We're here.
So I have the what's it called, the TSA pre-check, right? But in order to get TSA pre-check, because flying all over to do comic conventions, and I was like, I don't want to deal with the security line. So I just paid for an interview to go do this. And the woman who was doing my paperwork when I went to the H&R Block or wherever the interview was, she was like, you were born. She's like, you're born in 19. I'm gonna age myself. You're born in 1980. I was like, yeah. She's like, okay, you were born in Fort Ord. I was like, yeah. Well, what is this? Like, why? And she said, that's weird. I was also born there. And then she's like, I'm not supposed to ask you this. She's like, are you mixed race? And I was like, yeah, why? And she's like, I'm Filipino and Mexican. And she, okay, so I'm gonna
not Mexican. No,
so I'm gonna blow your mind. I don't know if you know this then, but she told me that in the 80s, a lot of interracial military couples were stationed in Fort Ord. So I asked my dad this, and he was like, what? I was like, did you not look around and like, and I think just by default, like they had moved from, I don't know where, my parents moved so many times during their marriage, but I think maybe just by default being in Southern California, they were like, okay, well, cool. I mean, not Southern, that's kind of Northern, but they were like, yeah, I guess there's Latinos here and whatever. But I had never known that until several years ago. And so I thought it was so interesting that just by like default of who I was going to be because of my parents, that had some sort of like thing to do with where we were born.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
That's wild. I promise we're not just going to talk about this.
Yeah, we'll move on. We can move on.
But it's like, this is new information. Stop everything. No. So going back to your mission time in New York and stuff, were you already illustrating back then?
Oh yeah. I drew a lot in my childhood. I think most kids draw. I just like didn't stop doing it. And I also felt like something I tell a lot of young kids who are within I guess Mormonism, sometimes I'll speak at events like that, who feel like they have no control over their environment or who they want to be because of their environment or their the pressures put on them by their family, I guess. I tell them to just find something that you feel like you're really passionate about or that you're really good at. And if things are difficult, focus on that during those times. Because if you do that, for some reason in my mind, I thought as a kid, like if I do this and I become good at it, then I can make it into a job. And that job can help me live some sort of happy adult life where I'm supporting myself doing something that I love. And it doesn't have to be something artistic. Like you can be an expert at, I don't know, like bugs, like, you know what I mean? And then they're making some project about bugs and they hire you because you're the expert. So I feel like I was always drawing. I was always making up characters, writing. I was in some musicals in high school. So I've always liked to do artistic things. But when you're a Mormon missionary, you are not allowed to watch television, watch movies, read anything but the Bible or the Book of Mormon. You're not allowed to talk to your family. I mean, unless you're a missionary now and then they let you like Zoom, I guess, which fine. But I cried for like 2 days when I was gonna go because I knew that meant I was gonna miss seasons 5 and 6 of Buffy the Vampire Slayer. That's not a joke. I was like very upset. Willow had just come out of the closet. I was very excited, but yeah. That was literally the first thing I did when I got to California. I went to some DVD store, bought seasons 5 and 6 watches so I could watch season 7 anyway. But because you're not allowed to do a lot of that stuff, most missionaries on their like day off, they're like, let's go play basketball. I'm like, we are in New York City. Can we please go to like a museum or something? They didn't care. They just wanted to play basketball because I guess that's what you do in Sandy, Utah for fun. So I just always had a sketchbook because I would just draw on that on my days off and try to fill that up with whatever I could, whatever was fun to draw. And so I was sort of, I guess, maintaining it's difficult when you I think, are an artist, you like to draw, you're told, oh, you should draw every day, you should draw, from your life. But then you're like, oh, well, I can't, I got to teach somebody about Joseph Smith and how he was bored in the 1800s and created a religion because he didn't want to plow the fields anymore. So, yeah, I always drew while I was on my mission. And then after my mission, when I moved to California, I thought I was going to go to art school there and even applied to a couple. And then felt like it was way too expensive. So that's partly why I moved here.
And was there a time, because you started drawing from a young age, maybe you're not thinking about like, yes, I'm going to fully express my multiple identities, and as a 8-year-old, whatever. Yeah. Was there a moment where your technical skill and passion for art like met up and like intersected with like, actually, I'm gonna tell stories about who I am, even if they're not specifically about me, but like when was that?
I feel like that was actually when I was in art school here. I felt like I got a lot out of it because I felt like I put a lot into it. I went to the University of Idaho for a year right after high school before my mission. But, what was that? 7, 8 years later was when I started back up at college here. So I was a little bit older than most of the other people in my class. And I don't think that if you're young, you can't, be dedicated and whatnot. But I felt like I did have a different, I guess not advantage, but it was because I was in a military family. I felt like, oh, okay, this first year is like boot camp, and they're weeding out everybody right now who's not serious about it. And next year, I guess we'll see who is still here. And there were many students who were like, well, but I'm an illustration major. Why should I have to do a sculpting class? And I was like, if you can sculpt something in 3D, you're going to be able to draw it in 2D. It's like, fine, just you're playing with clay. Can you just like calm down? And so when I was in art school, though, I felt like as somebody who was studying illustration, I had to think about like, well, what is it that I have that I can offer that's going to be different or unique than a lot of the other students here? When we would get a prompt of an assignment to draw, I would try to think, okay, well, what's the first thing that I'm going to think of? Is that what everyone else is going to think of? Well, then I don't want to do that. So I would try to think of something else, and I began to think about, especially with some of the assignments we were given, think about who I am, what I wanted to illustrate. I don't even remember what the prompt was, but the illustration I ended up painting was an illustration of my mom in the 80s wearing this like traditional Mexican clothing, but these like huge plastic Walmart glasses, kind of, because that was what I remembered. And so I felt like it was saying something about her identity. And I still feel like that's one of the better pieces that I did in art school. So I think during that time, it's not that you have to have some sort of specific thing to say about your cultural identity, but you could make artwork that says something about your spiritual identity or your sexual identity, like whatever you want to do. I just didn't want to do what I think felt not necessarily was the easiest thing, but so for instance, like one of the first assignments we had was like worship, and so I was like, oh, everybody's going to draw church stuff, and I'm done. Like I don't want to do that. So I drew an illustration of I don't remember her name. Abigail from The Crucible, like this pilgrim covered in blood. Because I was like, well, she really worshipped that guy, and look what it did to her. And so I was more interested in that and doing something slightly different. And maybe that didn't have anything to do with necessarily my cultural identity, but I do think it said something about the things I like, the things I gravitate towards. My first book was like, it's about kids at like a weight loss summer camp. But then there's a murder that they witnessed. Yeah. So like, I like to incorporate, this like kind of, I don't know, sweet facade that has something else underneath it. But yeah.
It's a very fun book, Deadweight.
Deadweight Murder Camp.
Now I was like, I want you to tell the story of how like you came from doing, because you before you did Deadweight, you were mostly doing like commission stuff. Is that or? Sort
of. Yeah, I was doing a decent amount of commissions, but my comic book work, or my work in the comic book industry started mostly with doing covers for comics. I did some interior comic work, but when you draw comics, you have to be able to draw everything, like anything that's on the page of the script, and I just don't want to draw bikes and cars and buildings and stuff like that. If somebody was like, do you want to draw Spider-Man swinging through I'd be like, no, get me out of here. And I love drawing people. I love drawing portraits. I love drawing animals. And I had to think like, well, if I want to be involved in the comic book industry and still make comics, what else is there I can do? I can still do covers and that's fine, but I thought, well, I've always enjoyed making up characters. I've always enjoyed creating stories, so why don't I try writing? I knew that I wanted to take it seriously, but I was like, I can't afford to go back to school to study writing. So how do I do this? And I was drawing covers, drawing comics. While I was doing that, I was, listening to podcasts, watching movies I'd seen a million times just to sort of entertain myself while I was doing this. And I thought I could use my time better than I'm using it. And as I drew comics, I made YouTube my second college degree, and I looked up every tutorial I could on comics writing, on writing scripts, on story structure. That led me to like other books about it that I then found and read. And so I just studied that as much as I could, wrote notes about it, and thought, okay, well, I can try this. Maybe I can do it. Usually when people are starting out in comics, a very common piece of advice that a lot of students don't seem to want to take is to make short stories, like 10 pages max. A lot of the students that I mentor through PNCA are like, okay, so I have this 325-page saga. It's about these 10 races of elves and the 15 languages that they speak. And I'm like, cool, but what's the story? And then they get flustered when I'm like, cool, but I need 10 pages, right? And the whole reason for doing that, I think, when I started writing my first book, and it was accepted at Oni Press, a local company, they were like, cool, 160 pages. And I was like, I don't know how to write that. I couldn't visualize it in my head. And then I thought, well, if I break it into chapters, I can tell a 10-page story. So I tried to look at it from like a bird's eye point of view and say, okay, well, if I break it into, say, 16 chapters, not every chapter has to be 10 pages. There's a little leeway. You can do one chapter that's 12, and then the next one is 2 pages less. And that's how I started to construct larger books. And I felt like it really helped, and I used that sort of system for every graphic novel script that I write. But yeah, I just started out doing covers. I knew that there's the cartoon Adventure Time. They were making a lot of comic books based off of that IP, and making a lot of covers, like variant covers for them. So I thought, well, that's my best bet at getting comics work, right? I didn't even ask, I just drew a cover. And a friend of mine at Helioscope had been doing covers for them. And I asked her, like, would you mind sending this to your editor? And she was like, yeah, sure. So she did, and I was very conscious of like, I need space for the title, I need space for the barcode over here, and then the editor emailed me and was like, yeah, cool, let's use it for issue 4. I was like, all right. But when you do, it was very much like art school, because if you do a cover for a comic book company, they're like, okay, can you draw us 3 options, send us some sketches, whatever. Then they'll narrow that down to like 1. Then you'll have to do the pencils, and they'll need notes on that. You'll have to do the inks, they need notes on that. And editors are juggling so many different projects that I felt like, well, I just did a bunch of the work for this editor. Like, it's done. She doesn't have to seek somebody out. She doesn't have to do notes on it. So then I ended up meeting that editor at a convention. I'd never met her in person. And I was like, oh, hey, I really like the books you guys put out. I just read this other title, and it's one of my favorites. She's like, cool, do you want to do a cover? So, just meeting people and continuing to do work that way, I feel like was helpful in terms of making connections and working in the comic book industry. And that editor is currently my editor on another book that I'm doing right now. So, I've fostered a relationship with her throughout the years, and I think that she's one of the best editors I've worked with. So
It's awesome. A continuing thing, like talk to people. Don't be like me and stay inside at home like a little cave troll.
Oh, I do that plenty. I do that quite a bit.
So you have done, writing for your own stuff, and now, well, in the past, also Reptile stuff for Marvel. Like, that's kind of a big deal, and Nova as well. What's it like doing something for a big publisher versus your own personal stuff?
I like both experiences. They're very different, but something like Marvel, they reached out to my agent and were like, there's this character that's been around in comics for a while. They're this Mexican-American teenager that can turn into dinosaurs. I was like, when I heard that, I was like, I've never heard of this character before. This would be the character that as a child I would have wanted to know more about. I mean, I was that kid that was like, Archaeopteryx was the first bird found in a limestone fossil, you know. So I was like, well, maybe I don't know, maybe they knew and they thought I'd be good for this. But I thought if he's Mexican American, if he's a kid, like he should be one of the most popular Marvel characters for kids, right? Like they should know who he is. And so I read like 40 issues of all the comics that he'd appeared in like 2 days. I'm very much like, if I can get a pitch in before someone else, it doesn't have to be perfect, but if it's good enough, then these editors are going to say like, cool, that works. And they're not going to look for anybody else. So I like to operate by like speed. So I read all those comics as quick as I could. I thought about logically, like, where should this character go? Like his parents were archaeologists who disappeared on a dig. And I'm like, does he not want to know where they are? Like, so that was my pitch. I was like, well, he wants, there's going to be a villain who's going to show up and say, you're going to give me your power and you're going to do it willingly because I know where your parents are. And I thought that would be an interesting journey for him to take. And it is strange writing characters who are already established, or say like with Rick and Morty or Steven Universe, like those characters have specific voices that people hear when they watch the cartoons. So you have to think about the way they speak, you know, certain verbal cues they have, verbal tics they have. You know, you don't try to just like throw those in to make it sound like it, but you try to make it feel like something that they would actually say or do. So yeah, that's sort of how that book came about. I'm pretty sure I got my pitch in first because they chose me. But that was the same thing with Steven Universe when I wrote those comics. They approached me about it and I was flying to California the next day. And I was like, but I really want to do this. I know this story. I know I can write this story. And so I like put on the 3 episodes that pertained to what they wanted me to write. And I was like putting a shirt in my suitcase and then like taking notes and then like putting a shirt in my suit, taking notes. And that night I wrote up a pitch for it real quick, sent it off. And then when I landed in California the next day, I had an email that was like, that works. Let's do it. So awesome. Listen, when you grow up military and Mormon, you thrive on like communication and meetings. And there's plenty of things that I think I acquired from my upbringing that the way I reconcile a lot of my mission is by saying like, you have to take the good from it and reject the rest. Like I learned New York City inside and out. I now know Cuban, Dominican, and Puerto Rican dialects of Spanish. I felt like as a missionary, you have to learn how to create a relationship of trust with somebody very quickly to manipulate them into your religion. But I felt like if I could use that in a sincere way, in terms of networking with somebody, you know, if you get people to like you, if you think about, well, what is it that we have in common that will make us feel a connection? Like, I don't think it's manipulative. I tell kids all the time, networking is mostly, in my opinion, getting to know people and making friends. Like we all want to work with our friends. When you're a kid, you play with your friends, you make up stories with your friends. And if you, especially in an industry where there's a good amount of money going back and forth, people want to know that who they're working with is somebody they can trust to do the job. So sometimes you have friends and you're like, oh, no, like I know they won't get something in on time, but then you know somebody else who really will. And I think that's helpful in terms of networking and getting to know people is, you know, you can always recommend somebody. I've had jobs that people have recommended me for because they knew I would do it quickly or do it the way that they needed it to be done. So, and I was recommended for them by other people. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
No, totally. And it's nice to hear that you do have something valuable from the Mormon experience and like this sort of mandatory like mission time. And I know there's a documentary that you participated in about gay, lesbian, trans Mormons, current Mormons and ex-Mormons. It's not out yet.
They just finished editing it. Ooh. Do you want me to draw some stuff for it? Okay.
Like, not just people
all right.
dying.
Yeah. There's a lot of that.
Yeah. So you seem to like quickly move on from that time in your life, and there's certainly folks who have struggled to do that because maybe that's really important to them, maybe they just don't know how. I don't remember the question.
Yeah, I don't fault anyone for. I met plenty of people making the documentary and speaking at some of those queer and LDS related events who are definitely still religious, definitely still members of the church. I don't tell anyone how to live their life because I expect them to treat me that way. But I understand that there's a lot of societal pressure to maintain, some sort of relationship with your spirituality, your religion, and your family. I met a kid in Utah who was like, "How do you not fight with your family every day?" And I was like, I don't talk to my family every day. Like, I don't live near them, and I don't think that moving solves your problems. But I told him, I was like, right now you're very young, and your entire world is Sandy, Utah. So everybody you know is LDS. So if you tell, like if you want to remove your name and records from a church, an organization like the LDS Church, I was always raised being told, oh, well, you have to go talk to your bishop, and then your bishop has to say, okay, cool, let me refer you to your stake president, and then they have to, there's like a lawyer who will do all of it for you. You don't have to talk to anybody. But the reason I feel behind that is because then your bishop can then tell your family like, oh, well, did you know that so-and-so is thinking about? So then there's this pressure to maintain that. Like I said, I'm not a spiritual religious person, but speaking at those events, I feel like that doesn't mean I can't get something out of somebody that's there and that they can't get something, meaningful or whatever out of me. But it was important for me to do because I'm going to bring it real down for a minute. But no, I don't think a lot of people know that I think this is still the case, but the highest suicide rate in the country is amongst Mormon teenagers in Salt Lake City who identify as LGBTQ. And nobody's talking about how an organization that runs like 90% of what happens in that state might have something to do with it. In fact, the state of Utah released a statement saying that attributing the high death rate to rising elevations. And I'm like, so exclusively queer teenagers in Salt Lake City can't breathe because it's like rising up to heaven? I don't know what that means. So that's just ridiculous to me. And I feel like as somebody who's, I don't consider myself a member of the Mormon community. I acknowledge I was raised that way. But I think it helps to, for maybe young people to see someone living an adult queer life, since that's not something that I really saw growing up for myself. I didn't have something to model that on. And I think it's really difficult to visualize that. Like I have a good imagination, but it's difficult, I think, to picture yourself living a way that you want when you don't see that modeled for yourself. That's why I'm also a big proponent of like representation in all the books. Every book I write has pretty much my original graphic work, unless it's like Steven Universe or something that's already whatever. But that typically features queer leads and leads who are Latina, because the fastest growing demographic in the United States is the college educated Latina. But whereas all the like stories for them, still quite often I think Latinas are stereotyped as on television and movies as like the frumpy maid or the funny maid or like Sofia Vergara kind of like sex pot thing, right? Mm-hmm. And I was like, well, where are the stories to show Latinas that they're like interesting or brave or flawed, or like we can't just rely on Ugly Betty. Like we need, like it's been a while, we need like something else. So I want all of my work to feature that because I feel like that's something that's needed. And maybe I'm not the best person to do that, but somebody has to do it. So it may as well be me.
Final little story that I want you to tell before we get some audience questions. I don't know if everybody saw some of Terry's art up here, but there was like an Aztec Superman. He does Aztec Wonder Woman and Batman. I'm the big three. That's me. That's how I grew up. And when I saw those, I was like, oh my gosh, I want to know more about them. And can you tell the story of how that came about?
Sure. I grew up in a house with like Aztec statuary. My parents liked having statues of like Aztec warriors or whatever, and they wonder why I want like a million action figures. It's like, but I'd always had that kind of imagery in my house, and I had this T-shirt that was black with the eagle from the Mexican flag on it, but instead of brown, whatever, it was gold, like a gold decal or whatever. And I was walking down the street around the time the Wonder Woman movie came out, and some guy was like, "Hey, I like your Wonder Woman T-shirt." I was like, because she has like a golden eagle, right? And I'm like, this is not her like chest armor. This is the Mexican flag. I don't know, but because of that, in my head, I was like, well, why not then? Like, okay, so I just mixed the two together, and I was like, yeah, then I'm going to draw an Aztec warrior Wonder Woman, and I wanted to be able to. Like, I wanted it to be like a second read. Like, if you saw it from far away, you'd be like, oh, Wonder Woman. But then you get closer and you're like, oh, there's differences here. Same with the Superman one. But it was like my most purchased piece of artwork, like print online. And so because of that, people were like, well, are you going to draw Superman? I was like, oh, all right, fine. So I did. And then people were like, well, are you going to draw Batman? I was like, okay. So I did. And then, well, yeah, are you going to buy it? Those are two very different things. And then people were like, well, are you going to draw? And I'm like, no. So those were the three that I did. But I thought it was a really funny sort of blending of like, comic books, superheroes, things that I like, in addition to like my culture, like a blending of those things. So
yeah, for sure. I think these kind of big characters, I mean, the corporations are trying to make them so universal. It's like, well, if it's universal, it can also be specific, like really specific to.
I think people think that if they, especially in storytelling, if I write this and it appeals to everyone, then more people are going to want it. But the exact opposite is true. Like, the more specific you make something, the more, like, how many people watched that movie forever ago, like My Big Fat Greek Wedding, and they're like, oh, that's my family, but they're like not even Greek, right? It's like, you just relate to the story of this family because they are similar to yours in specific ways, but it's a specific story to the person who wrote it. And so I think that oftentimes that's the case. The more specific you are about your own experience and your writing, the more people actually relate to it.
Nice. So we have time for some audience questions. Oh, all right. Here, question.
I'm curious to hear about your experience working on
Oh,
Oh.
let me repeat the question. The question asker asked about your experience with Rick and Morty.
I did several covers for them, so those were my first interaction with them. I asked them, can I just draw Summer driving her space car? And they were like, sure. And so I put Rick and Morty in the back, and it was a parody of the poster for Tu Wong Fu, Thanks for Everything, Julie Newmar. Nobody really knows that, but I guess they do now. And then I was asked to write several issues of the comic. And so I basically thought, oh, cool, well, I'll watch Rick and Morty for research. So that's kind of fun that you get to do that. But there is an element of like, trying to think about what you're going to write and how you're not going to contradict who that character is, so that when people read the comic, it feels like the show or what they're used to. Then I basically watched the whole series because I was like, well, I don't want to come up with an idea, and they're like, we've already done that, or so I was like, oh, I'll give Morty this idea of like challenging Rick, like, oh, you think you're so smart? Well, you think you're the smartest person in the world? Well, can you create something that loves you unconditionally? And he's like, well, yeah, of course. And he's like, no, you can't create it to do that. You just have to create it and see if that is what happens. So Rick ends up making this like alien centaur boyfriend kind of thing, and then has to like let him go. I don't know, but the editor loved it, but it was really bizarre and weird. And then because Rick and Morty does have an element, I think, of parodying some stuff, sort of in the way that a lot of other cartoons do, I was like, okay, well, can I do like a Pokemon parody, or can I do like a, whatever? And then you basically have to come up with an idea and then everything goes to shit, So it was a fun experience. I really enjoyed writing that comic. And I got to work, the artist that worked on that is one of my best friends, Benjamin Dewey, who's local Portlander too. And his work on it was really great. So it was a really fun experience.
Any other questions in the audience?
I claim Rick is a Latino character because his last name is Sanchez.
Well, thank you all for coming. I hope you, I had a wonderful time.
Me too, thank you.
Literally born in the same hospital.
I know, that's
absolutely
wild.
So what fun. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for being here. Yeah. Enjoy.